It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the insurmountable John Hersey and the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably John Hersey. How you doing this morning, John?
I'm fantastic. I'm rearing and ready to go to talk about Andrew Carnegie today. I learned a lot about him just over this past week, and what an impressive individual. He's incredible.
Absolutely right. Which is why it's long overdue that we awarded him with a segment here. And I want to say, I want to say in passing here that it's great to be back to the Hero Show after our foray into villainy last week. And hear the music and the robust, upbeat music rather than that squeaky, Halloween kind of frightful tunes we had for the villain show. Nevertheless, the villain show is good every now and then, but our purpose is to venerate great heroes, and you are right, John. Andrew Carnegie is an impressive specimen of heroism. He's just an extraordinary life story.
And his life overlapped with our villain of last week, Vladimir Lenin. And well, Lenin was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands, or at least 100,000, maybe
Well,
140,000. Carnegie,
at,
well, and of course, he set up
at
the
least,
machinery for
yeah,
millions, but yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
But Carnegie made himself, enriched everyone that worked with him and for him, and became the richest man on earth. So, what a contrast! I really love our focus on heroes, but it's also it's good to bring out that contrast every once in a while with a villain show and just talk about some of the ideas and the people behind those ideas that have destroyed so much human life and so much human progress.
Right, right. And Carnegie's life really overlaps with John D. Rockefeller, who we
Mm,
celebrated in the past as a hero and a great producer. And it all integrates, John, because the first villain show we did was Karl Marx, and
mm,
their lives overlap with Marx, who, by the way, for a while worked when he was living in Britain, worked as a foreign correspondent for one of the New York newspapers, but
that's
never
right.
really. He was an inveterate European. He never really paid much attention to what was going on across the pond in the United States, and the enormous wealth creation. Marx died in 1883, and by that time, Rockefeller and Carnegie were both well established industrialists producing copious amounts of oil and steel. But to Marx, that didn't figure in his assessment. And so the enormous productivity of these so-called robber barons, who are really these productive giants, has gone simply unnoticed or dismissed, by Marxist intellectuals from that day to this. So
Yeah.
we'll get in a few criticisms of Marxist intellectuals before we're done today, because Carnegie's a favorite target of theirs. But the positives first, right? Born in
Uh,
Scotland, Andrew Carnegie, born in
yes.
Scotland.
Yes.
There he
Born in
is.
Dunfermline, Scotland, to William and
You
Margaret.
say that you
Uh,
say that so well.
oh
Dumferline. I
well.
like it.
It must be my English blood. I got my family tree and it goes way back to the 1600s and it's all English. I know there's some you know,
There's no
just
Scottish. There's no
just
Scottish in it.
a little bit
No.
Irish, a little bit English. I wish Scottish. I mean, I've been to Scotland and it's one of my favorite places on earth. I love Edinburgh. I love Glasgow. Um, but
By
yeah,
by the
born
way,
to William and Margaret.
I've
Go
never
ahead.
been. Never been to Scotland. I'd love to get there, especially in the summer. Carnegie used to travel back to Scotland in the summer to
Yeah.
escape the heat here because it's cooler there. But I can say proudly that my paternal grandmother was Scottish Presbyterian, Mary Rebecca Phillips, honor my grandmother here. My Andrew Scott is my name and middle name. So there's the Scottish, there's the Scottish lineage there. But yeah, born Scotland, 1835 to 1919. Those are Carnegie's dates. I assume you have some good information for us about his childhood, John.
What a cool childhood. I mean, so his parents told him that he didn't have to go to school unless he wanted to, and they wouldn't force him to go to school until he chose to. And so he spent a lot of his childhood hanging out with his uncle George Lauder. He had a shop on High Street, which was, there's this sort of aristocracy among the merchants, and High Street was the best you could be. And he'd go and hang out at his uncle's shop, and his uncle was actually responsible for teaching him a lot about English and Scottish history. He taught him a lot about William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. He learned to recite poetry. He learned to recite a lot of Robert Burns. And it's kind of funny. He developed, we love heroes on this show because there are these, uplifting stories, and they give us something to emulate. Well, Carnegie actually modeled this, and he absolutely loved William Wallace. Funny story, his uncle would ask him, because there was two paths that he could take to get home from his uncle's shop back to his house. He could either take the well-lit street path, or he could go through the unlit cemetery route. And his uncle would always ask him, so which you going to take? And he was like, well, he was thinking, well, which would Wallace take? I'm going to go through the cemetery. And so he did. Whenever he got spooked by an owl or something, he would just think, well, what would William Wallace do? So I just love that. But yeah, he grew up loving heroes. His father ran a hand loom, and not long after he was born, the Industrial Revolution started to impact Scotland. Steam-powered looms were introduced and really obliterated the business. And so they did various things to try to keep afloat. He did end up attending school for a couple of years and learned a lot from his schoolmaster there. But a variety of things conspired to bring them to America. And one was the family was their politics were pretty radical. They were very opposed to kingly rule. And he said that my uncle, like all our family, was a moral force of a man, strong for obedience to law, but radical to the core and an intense admirer of the American Republic. And Carnegie loved his Scottish heritage, but when he'd been in the U.S. for a while, he really came to respect America a great deal, and even to advocate for republicanism in England. So really interesting admiration both for heroes and for America.
Right. And, like you said, Carnegie, his father's name was William, wasn't it? William Carnegie?
Yeah.
As I recall. And William Carnegie was a poor hand loom weaver, and they emigrated to America when Andrew was 12. And again, this brings me back. I'm an inveterate philosopher, John. I want to integrate it with the philosophers. This brings me back to Marx, who argues that because the Industrial Revolution puts the hand loom weavers out of business. That's true. And so, Marx, of course, argues in the Communist Manifesto that all that remains for the hand loom weavers, since now cotton clothing are made in the factories, is to work in the factories, and there's no other option. And he's like overlooking the obvious. Well, it's not obvious. Overlooking the fact. Well, some people emigrated to America. Some people crossed the pond, which is exactly what Andrew Carnegie's parents did. There are always other options, in a free society and in a free nation than this rigid determinism that Marx, stands for. By the way, I remember I gotta put in a plug here. His Catman, right? The Capitalist Manifesto. Yeah, the historic, economic, and philosophic case for laissez-faire, which I published in 2005. And so, I did a lot of research, for this book back then. And I read, as part of the research, John, and everybody out there in Hero Land, I read Burton Hendrick's biography of Carnegie. It was a massive 2-volume, work. The Life of Andrew Carnegie, I think, is the title. But Burton Hendrick has often been criticized for admiring Carnegie too much. But, that's part of the book's appeal, is Hendrick has great respect for Carnegie. And there have been a number of biographies of Carnegie since. But I think Hendrick is the best because of his enormous respect for Carnegie's abilities and his productiveness. Now, subsequent to that, of course, Ayn Rand published Atlas Shrugged, and later her nonfiction essays demonstrating, in the objectivist ethics, in the virtue of selfishness, that productivity is a great moral virtue. And Hendrick didn't have the opportunity to read Ayn Rand before he wrote that biography, but he senses it. He gets it. It's on an implicit level that Carnegie's productiveness is enormously virtuous. So I recommend Hendrick's biography of Carnegie. It's hero worshiping. It's very, very good.
Speaking of this idea of the difference between the sort of European class warfare type of thought and the American achievement-based ethic, I just want to read this passage. I've got a copy here of Andrew Carnegie's autobiography. He's got this amazing passage. This comes about when he is on a little expedition to check out some oil wells. And there's a bunch of Americans who have set up shop, and they've got a brass band, and they've sort of built a small civilization in the middle of nowhere very, very quickly. And he wrote, "It would be safe to wager that 1,000 Americans in a new land would organize themselves, establish schools, churches, newspapers, and brass bands, in short, provide themselves with all the appliances of civilization, and go ahead developing their country before an equal number of British would have discovered who among them was the highest in hereditary rank and had the best claims to leadership owing to his grandfather. There is but one rule among Americans, the tools of those who can use them."
That's great.
I mean, this is incredible.
That's great. Much as we admire the British, that is, there's a lot of truth to that with their undying, respect for the aristocracy. Whereas, Carnegie's talking about, of course, the aristocracy of ability. Those are the ones who should lead, whether their grandfather was a duke or not, is irrelevant. Or whether their grandfather was a slave or, an everyday working man. But it's interesting about Carnegie because, we were discussing at times his line about having a sunny disposition. I don't remember the exact quote, but a sunny disposition is more valuable than a fortune or something like that.
Yeah.
Carnegie.
Yeah.
Carnegie said, and he had, that sunny disposition. He was an optimistic, sanguine kind of guy, grounded in his can-do attitudes and his can-do abilities. And his biographers say that even on the ocean passage, and when the family was crossing the pond in heavy seas, most of the people were seasick. But 12-year-old Andrew was scampering around the ship, talking to the sailors, learning seamanship from them, and in his ebullient personality, and that the sailors respected, and loved this young kid who had so much energy and so much want to learn, in this case, how to be a seaman and everything. He had that spirit, and it certainly helped drive his extraordinary rags to riches story.
Yeah, he's 10 years old. He's on this 7-week journey across the pond, and the ship is badly undermanned. They don't have enough people, and so he's just like, "What can I do? Where can I help out?" And when they get to New York, one of the sailors, who's kind of taken a liking to him, awards him with this glass of sarsaparilla, which is sort of like a soft drink that tastes a little bit like root beer. And he's like, "It was like the nectar of the gods to me. And here I was in New York, said the first great hive of human industry among inhabitants of which I mingled, and the bustle and excitement of it overwhelmed me." He was having fun, and everyone else was like pretty miserable, which is just incredible. It really does speak to that sunny disposition, like you were saying, Andy.
Yeah, and the family is locates in western Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh, right? And the father is still a handloom weaver, and there's no money to be made, in that. And young Andrew, the story of about being a bobbin boy in a factory is presented by any number of people. So it sounds like it's historically accurate. He goes to work age 12 as a bobbin boy in a factory for $1.20 a week. And his job is 12 hours per day, 6 days a week. His job is to change spools of thread, in the looms. and $1.20 a week in 2020 terms is $35 a week he's making. Um, and at that, within a couple of years, he's the main breadwinner in his family. So I mean, he is the quintessential rags to riches story. When he sells Carnegie Steel, to J.P. Morgan in the early 20th century, and for $300 million, which is billions of dollars today in today's purchasing power, he becomes briefly the wealthiest man in the world. Rockefeller eventually surpasses him, but he goes from a boy making $1.20 a week to being the wealthiest man in the world in one lifetime. It's just an extraordinary story.
Yeah, when he got his first paycheck, he was just so proud of it because he'd been dependent on his parents his whole life. He said later, I've made millions since, but none of those millions gave me such happiness as my first week's earnings. I was now a helper of the family and a breadwinner, and no longer a total charge upon my parents. And this industry attracts attention. This reminds me of Benjamin Franklin, who I think Carnegie was inspired to a great extent. Franklin said, "Industry need not wish," and they didn't always have it easy, the Carnegies, but he very quickly was able to attract attention because he was just so industrious, so hardworking. He was soon wooed away to go work for the manufacturer of bobbins for some higher pay. He was put to work manning a steam engine and a boiler in the basement, and he'd have nightmares about this thing exploding or him not doing a good enough job, not providing enough power to the people who were working above. But instead of breaking down or even complaining to his parents, once again he'd ask himself, "What would Wallace do?" And so he was always thinking back to his heroes and trying to emulate their courage, their commitment to their chosen task, and it just continued to lead him. I mean, this is remarkable, and it's something that I think we can emulate his hero emulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to tie this into an economic point here. Carnegie starts out at age 12, working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. I mean, what is that? That's 72-hour work week. I mean, that is just horrible. And so it reminds me of our current unions. I see these union guys driving around with their bumper stickers that read, "Unions, the people who brought you the weekend." I want to just punch the guy, as if without the government-backed unions, we would still be working. That's the implication. We would still be working 12 hours at 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. I just want to
was that Westinghouse who we covered? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Westinghouse did. Certainly shorten the work week. But the point, of course, the economic point is, that if people weren't making enough to support themselves on, let's say, a 40-hour work week, then legally mandating a 40-hour work week would be condemning people to poverty and children probably to starvation. What enables us to have a 40-hour work week is the immense productivity of the capitalist system. Any number of economists have pointed this out. Ludwig von Mises, for example, that as capital accumulates, as industrialists like Carnegie make money, they reinvest it in their business. They buy more capital equipment. They can hire more workers. The machinery enables the workers to produce, more wealth, more consumer goods. The rise of consumer goods, the supply of consumer goods relative to demand for it brings the prices down. People can support themselves and their families working fewer hours. So if capitalism survives, and today, John, it's kind of dicey. As I could see Chairwoman AOC as the head of a communist America, in 20 years, and I mean that. I'm terrified of it. But if capitalism survives, the innovations, and the wealth creation, there's no reason why we can't support ourselves working 30 hours a week or 20 hours a week or 10 hours a week or maybe a 1-hour work week if capitalism survives and we're able to produce that much wealth. So the coercive unions in many ways have militated against that, which I won't won't go into it at this point. But I just wanted to make that point. People were working 72 hours a week back then, including children, because they were poor. The capitalist system was just being born. It had inherited the terrible poverty of the feudal system in the past, and in America it was a wilderness that had to be built up. And it's the creation of wealth that Carnegie exemplifies so brilliantly. It's the creation of wealth that enables us to keep bringing down the work week. And like I said, if capitalism survives, there isn't any reason why we have to work 40 hours a week to support ourselves. It's very possible to work far fewer hours and support ourselves, as some people do.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question of incentives and what is it you want out of life, and what are your needs. And Carnegie, his family was poor. His father was in and out of work. His father worked at the same cotton factory that he did for a while. But Carnegie was motivated to take on more and more work, to make more and more money, to take on more and more responsibility, and to be more and more productive. And this is the sort of productivity that leads to the 40-hour work week, the weekend. I mean, we covered Westinghouse on a previous show, and he certainly cut the working week down by a day at his factories. And introducing that idea in time convinced a lot of other people to do the same. So
Right,
Carnegie,
right, right. The great French economist Jean-Baptiste said, produce, produce. That's the whole thing. And I know we might add to that: produce, produce, trade, trade. That's the whole thing. But
consume.
say yeah, but say is right. Carnegie exemplifies this brilliantly. We need to produce. We need to grow the food. We need to build the houses. We need to develop the petroleum products. And the greater the supply of these things that we produce relative to demand for them, the price comes down, and consequently, we can afford to have enough food to feed our family. It's all about the productivity of the capitalist system. I can't harp on this, not the government-backed unions that created the wealth that enabled us to bring down the work week and create the weekend. And I want to see it happen, in my lifetime, and certainly in my daughter's lifetime. I want to see that continue to a 4-day work week, maybe a 32-hour week, and then a 3-day work week, a 24-hour week, and people have more and more leisure time to devote to what they love. But anyway, you can tell I don't like the coercive, government-backed unions. But Carnegie, of course, exemplifies this brilliantly. He is as productive as any human being could ever be. He and Rockefeller, created the products, or provided the foundation of an industrial society: steel and petroleum products. And Carnegie he's a giant, John. There's no way around. He's a giant of productivity.
Yeah, he had his hands in everything. But he starts off in 1850, age 14. There's a local telegraph office manager who's looking for a messenger boy, and his uncle Hogan gets him in. He's talking to the telegraph office manager, and gets Carnegie there on trial. And he sees this as this tremendous opportunity to learn. He's coming from this, running this steam engine in a dirty factory, and now he's getting to do this clean job among men, businessmen, and he's very anxious to succeed. And so, what does he do? I mean, he really applies himself. He memorizes the locations of all the shops that he's frequenting, and he starts to test himself when he's not working. He'll just he would give himself a street name, and then he'd name all the businesses down one side and across, and then come back the other side. And then he'd give himself the challenge of remembering the names of some of the most important men, because these messenger boys would pride themselves on being able to deliver a telegraph in the street to a man that they recognize. Oh, I didn't have to go all the way to his office. It saves them time, but more importantly, it also gets them in front of these important people. And that, Carnegie said, is one of the most important things. I mean, this is just a fantastic opportunity for a young person, because you've got to interact with these people, and they're always looking for a wise young kid. And so this is a really great shot, and he made the most of it. Um, he takes his job really, really seriously, and in time, people don't show up for work. He's there one morning, and there's nobody there to receive a telegraph, and so
Mhm.
he does it. He takes it down, and then that proves that he has developed some skill with that. And then, when other people want to go on vacation, he gets this opportunity to become a telegraph operator, and just continues to learn. He says that the operating room of a telegraph office was an excellent school for any young man. So he was
And
fully engaged in his work.
we discussed Thomas Edison's. It's interesting. Edison had a similar beginning into his career. And again, their lives, Edison's life and Carnegie's life, largely overlap. But yeah, Hendrick tells that Burton J. Hendrick in his biography tells that story. That he was a messenger boy. He's a kid. And part of his job was to get to work an hour early, sweep out the offices, get things cleaned and everything. That he would blast through those tasks and then run into the telegraph operating room to study the instruments. And he had taught himself. Carnegie taught himself the Morse alphabet and the Morse code. So yeah, his energy and his desire to learn, and his industriousness and of course his very positive, upbeat, robust personality made him a favorite amongst his employers. And you could see this is a kid who's going to rise. In a free country, this is a kid who will rise to do special things, and of course he does. And by the way, I want to point something else out. He says, even more than the coercive, government-backed unions, people I dislike are Marxist intellectuals. I know plenty of them in the universities. So they're always making fun of Horatio Alger, nowadays. Now I've read Horatio Alger and some of his novels, and Horatio Alger was a 19th century American writer of boys' books. And one of the perhaps his most famous book has the unfortunate title of Ragged Dick. But Dick was this young Dick was this young kid, who was poor, so he was a ragamuffin. He was dressed, in a ragged way. Has other connotations today. We don't need to, pursue that. But uh, but what Alger wrote about always was poor young men or poor boys who rise, economically to become successful via honesty and a strong work ethic. That was always the theme of Horatio Alger's books, his rags to riches story, via honesty and a strong work ethic. And here, you mentioned Benjamin Franklin, and Alger is promoting the same ideas. This is what it takes to rise. And in a free country, of course, Horatio Alger is right. And Alger was very popular in the 19th century. It's a great message for boys or girls, to read, when they're young. That this is the way to in a free country. Or even a semi-free country. This is the way you rise up out of poverty. And of course, nobody in real life, nobody illustrates the Horatio Alger rags to riches story as well as Andrew Carnegie. From $1.20 a week work as a 12-year-old factory boy to the wealthiest man in the world. That is just, that is really a testament to many things about Carnegie, above all his work ethic. So yeah. By
He
the way,
talked
John,
about.
go ahead.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
I was going to just add to that point. He talked about anyone that was in full possession of his mind could take possession of anything that he had justly earned. I'm just paraphrasing here, but he saw very, very clearly the connection between the mind and productivity, and uh, he really understood that one should take a lot of pride in one's work and in one's life more generally. And this largely came from his mother. At one point, a family member or a friend, I forget which, suggested, when Carnegie they were trying to figure out, well, what sort of job should he get for his first job? And somebody said, well, you should go down to the wharves and sell stuff. And she like had this animal reaction of fury because she thought, no, that's below my son. Like he needs to have pride in his work, and he can't go be among those lowly wharf people who are going to corrupt him. He needs to
Sounds like a
retain
Jewish
his moral
mother.
character.
But his mother was a very positive influence in his life. She was a reader, as I recall, and helped instill in him the love of books and the love of learning. And yeah, Andrew had very little formal schooling, but he became a voracious reader, patron of the arts, and a writer. Published many, books and essays himself. And we'll discuss the Gospel of Wealth before we're done with the show. But uh, I'm sorry, John. Did you want to finish? Did you want to go ahead with that point about his mother?
Oh no, I mean just that they took very, very seriously moral character and pride and productivity, and they saw the connection between those things. It's just amazing that the Scots. I think this had a lot to do with that Scottish culture. That great book by Arthur Herman, How the Scots Invented the Modern World. I mean, so much
Great
of this
book.
goes to this. Yeah, excellent book, and really the Scots invented so much more than we think about, and Carnegie is featured there, and rightly so. I think there's this incredible Scottish work ethic that it plays a huge role and crucial role in Carnegie's success.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned it. I was going to bring up Arthur Herman's book too. How the Scots Invented the Modern World is a great book, and certainly Herman, who was a historian at the Smithsonian for a while. I'm not sure. if he's still there. But Scotland was the poorest country in Europe, prior to the Industrial Revolution. And that's saying a lot, because prior to the Industrial Revolution, poverty was rampant. But the Scottish Enlightenment is the fountainhead. I wrote on this in the Capitalist Manifesto. The Scottish Enlightenment was the fountainhead of the British Industrial Revolution. And yeah, there was so much that the Scots contributed to this process. We discussed Adam Smith, as a hero on the show. When we had on, last year, we had on Eamon Butler, right, the head of the Adam Smith Institute in London. And at some point in the future, we'll do James Watt, the inventor,
Absolutely.
the inventor of the Industrial Revolution, and who perfected the steam engine. And these guys were, the Scots were penniless, but they had this tremendous work ethic, like you said. And the University of Edinburgh became a bastion, of education. It was way ahead of Oxford and Cambridge, the English colleges. Edinburgh was the best school, maybe in the world. And Charles Darwin, another one of our heroes that we've studied, studied there. The Edinburgh Medical School was just, extraordinary. But yeah, Arthur Herman's book is great. As anybody out there in Hero Land, I strongly recommend it. There's something I wanted to read from the Capitalist Manifesto here, which is little known about Carnegie, John, and that is that he made money in oil. There's a lot of I made a lot of money in oil, and a lot of people, don't realize that. But where is that? Here, briefly, in 1859. After Colonel E.L. Drake's famous drilling of oil in western Pennsylvania, Carnegie recognized the opportunities and, despite the bumps and knocks of the rough journey, rushed to the region. The Story farm that he purchased for $40,000 was soon worth $5 million, and he had made a comfortable fortune in oil when the name of Rockefeller was unknown. So, Carnegie was able to recognize opportunity when it was there. This is something that wealth creators have. It's an insight that it's what's the future going to be. It's very hard to see. Like Henry Ford had another hero who we'll discuss. That he didn't invent the automobile, Ford. A lot the tinkerers were building cars on both sides of the pond, turn of the 20th century. But it was a rich guy's toy. Rich guys had cars and they raced them. Ford was the one preeminently who saw the future, that the automobile would replace the horse and buggy and horse and the horse as the primary means of personal transportation. We mass produced the automobile inexpensively, and so that gazillions of people can afford to buy it. Seeing the future is difficult. Carnegie recognized. I mean, people with oil. What is this stuff? It messes up the farmers' fields. It's a nuisance. It's annoying. But Carnegie was one of the early ones to say, "Oh no, there's great power, in petroleum as an illuminant, and has any number of uses." And he was wealthy before he ever went into the steel industry, in large part because of the money he made in the early days of the oil industry. So, and that ability to see the future, of course, certainly helped him when he turned his iron foundries into steel mills that would use the Bessemer process. Again, he saw the future. The Bessemer method for making steel was going to sweep the country and make. One of the things it made possible was the construction of skyscrapers. You couldn't have skyscrapers without the steel that Carnegie's mills were churning out inexpensively. So yeah, that prescient capacity to see the way Dagny Taggart in Atlas Shrugged in fiction sees the possibilities of Reardon metal, when many other people, other than Hank Reardon himself, didn't, and she did. And that's a rare and enormously valuable quality, and Carnegie definitely had it.
Yeah, and in Dagny's case, and I think this applies in Carnegie's as well, it's this incredible independence, this independence of mind that doesn't just rest one's own judgment on that of others. I mean, Carnegie did in many of these ventures, and he did collaborate with other people, but he was always there seeing, okay, these are the opportunities. So he grows up, he becomes he's working as a telegraph operator. He gets this incredible opportunity to go work for Tom Scott, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and just time and again he finds these opportunities. One time T.T. Woodruff approaches him. He understands that Carnegie is working for the railroad. He doesn't really understand what capacity he's in, but he approaches him with this idea of sleeper cars. We've got these train cars. We've got trains that are now going on longer routes, and people are on these things, are uncomfortable for days at a time. And so Carnegie's, this doesn't exist yet, but here he is. He's talking to the inventor of the sleeper car, and he sees the enormous potential. And although he doesn't have much money, he ends up going into business with Woodruff. Woodruff offers him, he offers him a one eighth of the company, but he's got to put money in and just hope that this is a good investment. But he sees that it is, and before long, the amount that they're spending to build these cars is far outstripped by the income. And so, again and again, he sees these opportunities, and it's just crazy how many things he gets involved with. So you mentioned oil, early 1860s. Shortly after, he starts a rail business because there's just this huge demand for rail. The Civil War has begun, and he for a time in 1861 actually becomes a superintendent of rail and telegraphs for the Union Army under his boss Tom Scott. But when it becomes clear that that's going to be a years-long ordeal, he's released to go back to run the Pennsylvania Railroad. But at the same time, he sees this need for rail. A lot of rail is made out of what is it? So there's a few different types of steel, and I'm forgetting which one is the softer. It's the wrought iron rather, and it's too soft, and so over time it's breaking down. And so he and some friends open up the Superior Rail and Rolling Mill factory. They open up a locomotive manufactory, and it's just business after business. And it's not until 1865 when he's got like he's got 5 or 6 businesses that he's helping to run, that he decides to leave his job at the Pennsylvania Railroad. So it's just incredible how much he's got going
Yeah.
on. He's able to see opportunities everywhere.
Right, right. I mean, he's enormously industrious. We should point out, by the way, that Carnegie was a devout abolitionist and was
Mm-hmm.
working, for the, like you said, for the Union Army. Excuse me. Making sure the telegraph was in operating order. During warfare, people chopping down the poles and cutting the wires and everything. Carnegie was keeping the telegraph for the Union Army, in operating order, and collapsed, from heat prostration and overwork in the Virginia, in the Virginia sun, in the heat. And after that, he was very sensitive to hot weather. And when he was a wealthy man, and, as we said before, he journeyed back to Scotland every summer, for one, because that was, his homecoming for him, but two, it's cooler in Scotland, in the summer than it is, say in New York City. So, that's I think his. I have here, a copy of Matthew Josephson's Robber Barons, infamous book, The Robber Barons. I want to, comment on in a couple of minutes. But Josephson accuses Carnegie of being lazy, of not being a hard worker, and and it's ridiculous, especially in light of the fact that he collapsed from overwork and heat prostration when he was working, keeping the telegraph in order for the Union Army during the Civil War. There's so many things about Carnegie that are extraordinary. Again, he sees the coming of the steel age. In Carnegie's youth, steel is takes a long time to manufacture. So there's a lot of work hours. A lot of workers working a lot of hours. So it's an expensive process. Like, steel is brittle. It's it's simply not a viable product. But Carnegie sees, of course, that the American railroads are going to sweep the West. That there's going to be extensive miles of railroads. It's going to need track and steel bridges. When Carnegie developed developed his iron and later his steel making business, he was able to replace the old wooden bridges that could and sometimes did collapse under the heavy weight of freight trains, with iron and later steel bridges that didn't collapse. And Carnegie was very proud of his bridges that didn't collapse, and of course saved a lot of lives and facilitated freight traffic and thereby the production of wealth. But we should mention Henry Bessemer, John, because this again shows it's almost like a story out of Atlas Shrugged. Again, it shows Carnegie's independence, because Bessemer perfected the steelmaking process in England during Carnegie's lifetime. And there was, according to what I've read, John, and everybody out there in Hero Land, there were scientists in Britain that that doubted the efficacy of Bessemer's process. They questioned it. They didn't see the value of the Bessemer steel. Like in Atlas Shrugged, the State Science Institute, was very critical of Reardon metal, but Carnegie saw it. Carnegie saw the value of the Bessemer steelmaking process, and it's so ironic because Carnegie's famous for saying pioneering don't pay, and yet he pioneered all over the place. And when he saw Bessemer's process on one of his trips to Great Britain, he was convinced. I don't care what the scientists, in the metallurgists say. This is great. He came back to the United States. He started tearing down his iron foundries and building steel mills, using the Bessemer process. That steel was the future. Carnegie saw it again. Steel would be what we made the railroad tracks out of across the vastness of the North American continent, build the bridges out of. Eventually, like I said before, made possible the construction of skyscrapers. Gave Henry Ford inexpensive product to years later to manufacture the first automobiles. You go on and on and on with the advances made possible by Carnegie Carnegie manufacturing vast amounts of this new high quality steel and bringing the price of steel down dramatically. I don't remember what the numbers were, John. You might have the figures, but
Yeah,
from like
130.
18,
It was like, yeah, 1870s. It was $130 a unit, and then by 1890s, it had come down to $18. Was that a
right.
ton? I
And
forget what the units.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think it was a ton. Right. And that's largely, oops, sorry. That's largely Carnegie's doing because he's by far
Mhm.
the leading steel manufacturer in the United States and in the world. It's his doing more than anybody's because like Rockefeller in the oil industry, Carnegie was a stickler for efficiency, for cutting out waste, for using every possible product or byproduct of the manufacturing process, finding some commercially viable use for bringing down the cost. And so, yeah, by the 1890s, steel was in the United States was selling for $18 a ton, I think it was, which was way cheaper than it was before Carnegie's mass production of it. And it's amazing given the demand for steel. This shows how extensive the supply was that Carnegie created. Because given the demand for steel, it's going to keep the price high. But Carnegie created such an enormous supply of it that it kept it very inexpensive. And we should point out, I dropped the book here, but we should point out, John,
Those
that
numbers I gave, Andy, those were for iron actually. But of course you need iron to make steel. And so he did tremendously impact the price of steel for sure.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I have the numbers here in Campman, but while I'm looking, here it is. In 3 decades, this is quoting from the Capitalist Manifesto. In the 3 decades from 1870 to 1900, the American production of steel rose from 69,000 tons to more than 10 million tons per year. Prices, of course, dropped accordingly. Steel rails, for example, which were $160 per ton in 1875, cost only $17 a ton in 1898.
Mm.
So we're talking about steel rails. But let's put in a plug here for capitalism because the way that innovations build upon innovations in a free society, it's an aesthetically beautiful process. So by the turn of the 20th century, like we said, Henry Ford, is sees the future. Automobiles are going to become, the means of personal transportation. Well, he needs inexpensive steel in order to, be able to make the car affordable for thousands and thousands and millions, eventually millions and millions of customers. Carnegie provides that. He needs inexpensive fuel in order to power the automobile, so it's affordable. Well, Rockefeller supplied that. Skyscrapers, the distinctively American contribution to the field of architecture. Not an accident. William LeBaron Jenney and later Louis Sullivan, people like that, 1870s or 1880s, and in 1880s, I think in Chicago, are building the first skyscrapers. Well, skyscrapers take a lot of steel, John. And prior to Carnegie, mass production of steel, it would not have been commercially viable. And Elisha Otis's Elevate also makes skyscrapers, commercially viable because people don't have to walk up 50 flights of stairs, to get to the 50th story, or whatever. You see this extraordinary process. And one thing I wanted to point out here, since I'm an American, John, and I live to eat, the Carnegie steel, inexpensive steel makes possible. I think this is too often overlooked. The vast production of farm machinery in the United States, the John Deere factory, for example, the John Deere company, for example. John Deere himself was an innovator, in steel plows. But the combines and the harvesters and the tractors that enable American farmers to produce enormous amounts of food. Again, that takes a lot of steel, and it would be prohibitively expensive were it not for Carnegie, for farmers to be able to afford to buy, this the high tech equipment of the day. So the way the way innovations build upon innovations in a capitalist society, in a free society, in a free market, is really a beautiful thing. It's an aesthetically pleasing thing to see. Aside from in addition to the economic, the creation of wealth that benefits all of us. And Carnegie's production of steel was right dead center, in the middle of that process of American advances at the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, none of that would have been possible without the Bessemer process. And metal was, and steel in particular, was the subject of just a lot of speculation. People really didn't know how to create steel. They had some ideas, but they weren't clear on what element it was that either was added to or taken away from iron, from whether it be cast iron or wrought iron to create steel. And so it was Bessemer who identified, well, it's carbon. And cast iron's got about 2% or more carbon, and that makes it pretty brittle. But wrought iron's got about 0.1% carbon, and that makes it pretty soft. So what do you need? You need to get it somewhere in between. And so he came up with this scientific process. Well, carbon fuses with oxygen. We're just going to blow a bunch of oxygen into this liquid metal, and it will take out a lot of the carbon, and then we can add back what we need later, and strengthen this stuff and turn it into steel. And so people were no longer dependent on sort of the folklore of metallurgy to figure out what to do to create this. It was, let's turn this into a science that we can manage. And one of the things that set Carnegie apart was among his fellow steel and iron manufacturers, they had no idea how much material and time went into a ton of iron or of steel. And they didn't even really know how to measure that. And he was really anxious to get this stuff down and under control and understand, okay, how much, if we give somebody this much material, how much should we expect from them? And so he attracted many other very, very intelligent people, very active-minded people, and over a course of a few years, they were able to really get this whole production process down to a science, and that was what enabled them to make big bets on the future, because they could say, well, we put in this much, if we build a blast furnace of this size, we know we can get this much out of it, and we know we can make that back in this amount of time. So it wasn't this guessing game, and they weren't afraid to make big bets. They spent a lot of money on their furnaces. They were the first in the U.S. to adopt the Siemens gas furnace, which is it was seen as being obscenely expensive, and he thought, well, actually, it's obscenely expensive not to adopt it because you waste so much money, time, and material if you use smaller and less efficient furnaces. So it was applying this scientific and mathematical thinking to these problems that really set Carnegie apart.
Yep, absolutely right. So I have a great quote here, again, from putting a plug for the Capitalist Manifesto, but Carnegie himself described the eighth wonder of the world: iron ore, coal, limestone, and manganese mined in diverse geographic locations, then shipped to Pittsburgh and manufactured into 1 pound of solid steel sold for 1 cent. Such savings spurred construction of every kind in America, including of office buildings, apartment houses, automobiles, and later trucks, railroads, farm equipment, etc., to the immense material betterment of virtually every man, woman, and child in the country. And here, Carnegie has been, John, he's been an especial target of Marxist historians and intellectuals, so he and Rockefeller, as like the paradigm robber barons. And it remained for Ayn Rand to a lot of people admired Carnegie, and they sensed, that productivity was a great thing, and it increased the wealth for gazillions of people. But Ayn Rand pointed out, that in Atlas Shrugged and in her essay, the Objectivist Ethics, that productivity is a major moral virtue. That the requirements of human life constitute the standard of moral value, and we don't live metaphysically. We do not live in a Garden of Eden. We need to produce in order to sustain human life. Carnegie exemplifies that brilliantly. And I'm wondering, John, put this out here, if perhaps we should extend the Hero Show on Carnegie to a second week next week, do a part 2 on Carnegie, because other things we could say about his enormous productiveness. We need to discuss the gospel of wealth. I think we should answer Matthew Josephson and other Marxists, writers, intellectuals, and his charges in the robber barons against Carnegie. I think we should discuss the infamous Homestead strike. Well, that is one major reason why Carnegie is a gigantic target, for leftist intellectuals. I think, and I think Carnegie deserves a defense, regarding the Homestead strike, not just because he wasn't present at the time, but for other reasons as well. But I think we should do a second installment of the Hero Show on this giant of productivity. What do you think?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right, then. Well, I think we've seen enough here in installment 1 of and I correct me if I'm wrong. I think the Scots pronounce the name Carnegie. Is that right? It's Andrew Carnegie.
Yeah, his uncle George Lauder forever called him Nag, but yeah, Carnegie. Yeah,
Carnegie, right? The Americanized version of Carnegie, and the extraordinary philanthropy that he did, and a lot of good news. I certain things I would criticize about it, but there's a lot of good news in Carnegie's philanthropy. The way he targeted a lot of more interesting things. His relationship with Napoleon Hill, the writer who wrote the famous self-help book Think and Grow Rich. There's a lot of interesting things yet to discuss with Carnegie, but we've seen enough to put to truncate it right here for part 1 and say thank you, as Ayn Rand tells us in Atlas Shrugged. Thank you to Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, for making possible so much of the wealth that we take for granted. I'm going to go get my car, right now, and go into town. I'll be in New York City later, in certain skyscrapers, and just go to the American supermarket, which is a cornucopia of different foodstuffs. A lot of it made possible by the advanced farm technology, which uses heavy amounts of steel. So I think we should all say thank you to Andrew Carnegie, and with this, John, for this week, for this week's episode, I want to wish you have a more heroic day, and everybody out there in Hero Land to be inspired by giants like Andrew Carnegie and lead a more heroic life. Everybody,
you too, Andy.